Good morning. You can do better than that.
Good morning.
All right. I have to do that to my students as well. My name is Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, and I teach election law in Florida, where they sorely need it. But before that, I was here at the Brennan Center working on the issue of money in politics. And I think one of the big questions that confronts us is what types of reforms can one even do after Citizens United? Interestingly, Zephyr Teachout, who ran for governor in the state of New York, said that she thought it was more important to get public financing for states than to reverse Citizens United. And perhaps we can discuss that provocative thought a little bit later. But first, we have a wonderful panel of speakers to talk about reform tactics to address the issue of money in politics, and to discuss some of the legal and constitutional boundaries that these reforms must occupy in light of Citizens United, Bennett, McCutcheon, and other cases. Our first speaker is joining us via Skype. Congressman Sarbanes, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Congressman Sarbanes, could you please kick us off?
Well, thank you very much, Ciara. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all for indulging me remotely this way. Today we'll have the ability to vote by Skype, and I'll be able to be with you and do this in reverse. But we had two votes today that are going to be coming this morning, so I wanted to make sure I was here for those. I want to first off thank the Brennan Center for the amazing work that it continues to do, and also the Committee for Economic Development for being such a responsible and enlightened and constructive voice in the business community, stepping up behind different public policy questions, including for many years this issue of how we reform our campaign finance system. And I know there's a lot of other organizations in the room that will be represented on the various panels today. They've done really terrific work in this space for many, many years, and I want to thank you for your efforts as well and for being part of a broad and growing coalition of people, organizations across the country that have decided that their efforts to achieve real reform will not be denied ultimately. I wanted to talk a little bit about my effort here on Capitol Hill, H.R. 20, the Government by the People Act. To give you the context for that, I view the efforts to kind of fight back against big money in politics and pursue a reform agenda as falling into two baskets. The first is what I'll call rules-based reform, the idea that we put certain rules in place to try to constrain or limit or contain the influence of the big money players out there. And in that basket, you will find disclosure and transparency, a very important initiative that we've taken up here on the Hill, which is to give the public more information about where the money's coming from to hopefully help them make a more informed judgment on the effect of that money. So transparency and disclosure is one of the rules that we try to put in place. Non-coordination rules, which, as you know, are largely being observed in the breach right now. It's a very complex area, but those are important as well, particularly as we see this winking and nodding that goes on between the super PACs and the candidates that they support. So that's another important place that we can try to pursue reform. The constitutional amendment effort, which I support, it's a tough road to hoe. But again, the concept is, can we put some limits in place to try to contain or restrain the influence that the big money players are having out there through independent expenditures? So those are examples of rules-based reform of the system to try to address the undue influence that money is having. And those are important. There's another basket, though. There's another place we can turn to combat the influence of big money and pursue these efforts, and that's what I call power-based reform. And the idea is there to compete with the influence of big money by finding another place where power on behalf of everyday citizens can be collected and kind of push back and compete with that influence. And really what we're talking about is compete for the attention of candidates and members of Congress, people like myself. The reality is that candidates and people who are serving here on Capitol Hill, they will raise money where it can be raised. They will turn towards those sources of funding that allow them to be competitive in their campaign. And right now, if you want to be competitive, if you want to raise $1.5 million or so that it costs on average to win a campaign for Congress every 2 years, there's really only one place you can go to raise that kind of money in the amounts and as rapidly as you need to be competitive. And that's it's the deep-pocketed donors, it's the special interests. They're the ones who have the money, and candidates will go there to raise that money. If we could create a different place where candidates could go to raise the money to be competitive, I think candidates would be interested in that. And if that were a place where most Americans live, then we would create a completely different orientation for the political system. Candidates would turn towards everyday citizens to power their campaign. So that's what power-based reform looks like. It's a different approach than the rules-based approach. One reason I like the power-based concept, this empowerment frame, is that rules, as we've seen, and I know you've already had some discussion there today, but rules, as we've seen, money often finds a way to get around the rules. It's like getting around a rock water. Power, on the other hand, can't be denied. And so if you can respond to the power of big money with the power of small donors, then you've really created a solution that I think is inspiring to everyday citizens out there and can kind of collect their energy and direct it. That's the premise of H.R. 20, the Government by the People Act. We wanted to create something that would empower small donors to get the candidates and kind of weigh in again on their own democracy. So let me describe very briefly what that is. When we get into the panel discussion and the Q&A, I can certainly answer more questions. The Government by the People Act has three basic components to it. The first is a small donor tax credit, and the idea behind that is to give every American a $25 refundable tax credit for contributions to congressional campaigns. The idea there is if we're going to build a system that is dependent on the engagement of small donors, we need to make it a little bit easier for the average person out there to get into the game. And $25 or $50 or $75 contribution for most Americans is still a pretty heavy lift when you lay it against the other expenses they have. So we wanted to make it easier for them to make that contribution. That's what the refundable tax credit is designed to do, and we can talk more about the specs on that tax credit later if you'd like. So that gets people into the game. The second piece, which is absolutely critical, and people in New York are familiar with this concept, as are others around the country who are in state-based small donor matching systems. But that is to bring in a match, a multiple match of public dollars behind that small donation. We do that at the rate of 6 to 1. So it's very reminiscent of the New York City system in that regard. And we do it for donations, small donations, up to $150 per person. So someone gives a $50 donation, they now are actually worth $350 to the candidate. They qualify, a candidate qualifies for that match if they meet certain requirements. They have to build a small donor network. They have to agree to limit the high donation level that they receive, bring that down from the current limit of $2,700 per individual per election to $1,000. So that helps bring down that upper limit of private donations. And they have to agree to give optional PAC money if they want to qualify. But if they do all those things, then they can earn the match, the 6-to-1 match on small donations. The tax credit and the match really work together. A tax credit by itself, while it may get more donors to join the game, small donors, frankly, is not enough for the candidate to seek out those donors. It's the match that makes it worth it to the candidate to go find the power for the rights in everyday citizens. And we think those work very well together to energize the candidates to build a campaign that will find small donors and bring them in. The third piece of our bill is an opportunity for candidates to access some additional public funds in the home stretch of a campaign, the last 60 days, to maybe help them weather the storm that could come at them in terms of outside money or super PAC money. It's not designed as a trigger mechanism, so it doesn't get tangled up in the jurisprudence of this Supreme Court. We made sure that that was the case. But the combination of these three elements would be very empowering to small donors and would fundamentally, I think, change the behavior of candidates here on Capitol Hill. I'll close with a couple final observations. First, this is a very practical design. We built a model to run the numbers, the fundraising numbers from 2014 of my colleagues here on the Hill to see how they would fare using certain assumptions, how they would fare under this proposal if they joined a public financing system of the kind I've just described to you. And we determined that nearly 80% of my colleagues would do as well or better in terms of the money they could raise under the system we're proposing than they actually did in 2014. And that's critical in terms of selling this to my colleagues, because a lot of them will say to me, well, Sarbanes, you know, this is great in theory, but I got to live in the real world and raise money. And I can come back at them and say, well, we ran your numbers, and you'll be living in a world where you'll have more resources and more credibility with the public, because you'll be basing the financing of your campaign on small donors and the leverage that they can have over the system. The last comment I'll make is we think the motivation out there in the electorate, in the citizenry, to get behind this kind of reform will come from helping people connect the dots between issues that they care about and the undue influence that might have in Washington in terms of blocking progress on those issues. So even though I'm quite aware as a member of Congress moving around my district, that when it comes to politics, most Americans have left the building and run up into the hills, we can go find them using the issue they care most deeply about and lead them back into the political town square. So someone who cares about the environment, but may have fled the political discourse, we can say to them, if you care about climate change, if you care about cleaning up our environment, moving towards renewable energy, then let me explain to you how the oil and gas industry is having influence over the policy in Washington because of the amount of money they pour into campaign. And once that connection is understood, then you bring that back into the town square as a champion of campaign reform so that they can make progress. If we relieve that dependence on special interests, they can see progress on the issue that matters to them. For these reasons, I think the time is right to push a power-based reform solution along with the kind of rules-based efforts that are underway. And it has the fine, I think, inspirational dimension that it brings everyday citizens out of the bleachers onto the field not just putting a referee on the field to blow the whistle when some super PAC gives a candidate a steroids injection, but actually saying we're going to come onto the field, we're going to be players again, power players in our own democracy. That's a real motivator. I think it can be the game changer this time around. So thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel today. I think I went a little bit over, and I apologize for that. I'll try and keep my answers shorter on the back end. I'll turn it back to you, Ciara. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Costa.
Hi, my name is Jay Costa, and I am the executive director of a group called CounterPAC, which seeks to advance the issue of money in politics reform by creating incentives for candidates to bring reform to their own campaign practices, and thereby creating models of reform and action. So I'd like to start today by sharing with you all our general theory of politics, which is that at the end of the day, it's kind of like a game. And in this game, the candidates are the players, and the way they win this game is by getting elected to office. Now, in order to do that, they need to persuade voters to vote for them, which in turn takes money. Seeing as you're all here this morning, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you know about the huge magnitudes of money that it takes, and probably even think that it's a problem that it takes so much money. So I'm not going to spend time trying to convince you of that, but instead I'm going to focus on talking about if we want to change the rules of this game and reduce the influence that money has in it, how we might go about doing that. Now, like any player in any game, what candidates want most is to win. And so they're going to do whatever it takes to win. And as long as money is a key part of the strategy for winning, they're not going to be the ones to change the rules of this game and reduce the influence that money has. So we need to seek another point of leverage. Now, the most obvious one, we already know that candidates need to get votes. So if we could convince voters that this problem is so bad and get them angry enough that they're, ready to hold politicians accountable at the ballot box, then perhaps we could force politicians to take charge and change the rules of this game. The problem here is that, as it turns out, upwards of 90% of people think the problem of money in politics in our country is so bad that it's basically intractable, that it's basically impossible for us to solve it. And effectively they're looking at the situation that we have at hand here and saying, rather than, wow, this game stinks, let's get together and do something to change it, that corruption is inevitable, that it's just part of how the game is played. And so why would you get involved? Why would you try? Because it's really just a losing battle. It's not something we're ever going to be able to solve. So what we have here is a vicious cycle. Start with corruption, see how bad things are, and this makes people cynical. And the cynicism causes accountability mechanisms to fail because the public is apathetic, rather than going to the voting booth and holding politicians accountable for making reform happen, people are staying at home. And when these accountability mechanisms fail, that allows corruption to get worse, which breeds more cynicism, and round we go in this vicious cycle. So if we want to change the way that this game is played, we need to break this cycle. We need to restore accountability mechanisms, and to do that, we need to basically break this cycle of cynicism and restore public hope, restore the expectation that reform is possible. So we need people to basically look at the state of things and say, it doesn't have to be this way, let's work together to make change. Now you might ask, how do we do that? Well, the same way that you convince anyone of anything, you use examples. Fortunately, we have a really great example of the game being played differently. It came in 2012. Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown made a really simple agreement that radically altered the way that their campaign was run. They came together and they signed a pledge that said, if any outside money is spent on my campaign, that is, by a super PAC or other sort of outside group, I'll take money out of my own campaign account and let my opponent donate it to a charity of their choice. So what they're doing here is basically creating a really strong disincentive for outside groups to spend. Because if you're a super PAC and you want to help a candidate, if you try to spend on their behalf, you're really ultimately just going to hurt them because they're going to have to take money out of their own campaign account. to offset it. So it's a neat agreement, and even neater is the fact that it actually worked quite well. So relative to other competitive Senate races that year, outside spending was reduced by 93%, negative advertising is cut in half, and small donations exceeded outside spending by a factor of 3 to 1. So some really, really great results, and when we saw this, quite frankly, we were inspired. It's a great example of politicians coming together, reaching across the aisle, and taking action that has meaningful outcomes. And so we thought, what we really need as a movement, if we want to change the role that money in politics is playing, we need more examples like this. And so the whole idea behind CounterPAC is basically to try to seed more examples like this of reform working. So in 2014, we launched a pilot campaign to see what we could do in this regard. And we decided to start with a slightly different problem than all outside spending writ large. We decided to start with the problem of dark money. And we did this not only because it's a huge burgeoning problem, it's grown immensely over the last half dozen years and is expected to continue to grow, but because it also, disclosure as an issue has a wide amount of support across the ideological spectrum. And so, we thought that this would be a politically viable place to start. With the problem in hand, what we needed was a pledge-based solution similar to that that Warren and Brown enacted. And so we actually used their agreement as a model and really just slightly amended it to focus on dark money instead of outside money. Now that we have our problem and our solution, what we need are incentives to basically get candidates to take up the solution that we're trying to push. So like any other advocacy campaign, our work starts with an ask, please take this action, and it looks like formal letters, phone calls to the campaign. But the real incentive comes from another feature of CounterPAC, which I've yet to mention, which is, drumroll please, that we are also a super PAC. And so basically, implicit in our ask is the possibility that we could get involved in a race to spend for or against a candidate if we so choose. Now, we're a very weird super PAC in that at the start of every campaign, we are completely agnostic about who should win. We don't have any party affiliation. We don't have any favorites entering our races. But if there's a candidate, so really all we care about, I should say, is securing pledge agreements and really bringing reform to the races that we get involved in. But there is the possibility that if a particular candidate is obstructing a deal from being reached, we could get involved and spend against them or spend to support their opponent. What we're doing here is basically creating what's known as a prisoner's dilemma between the candidates. Neither one really wants to deal with us, but the possibility that we could get involved to attack them if their opponent comes to the table, it creates an incentive for them to deal with us and come to the table as well. So in 2014, we basically sought to answer the question, can this strategic model actually work? Can it succeed in changing candidate behavior? And we saw some really promising results. So for example, in the Alaska Senate race, we brought Mark Begich from a position of stringing us along and making excuses to actually coming out in public and saying he'd be willing to take our pledge exactly as written. And in the West Virginia 3rd Congressional District, we actually succeeded in getting both candidates to propose pledges. The first came from the Republican challenger, Evan Jenkins. And with some continued pressure, we actually got the 19-term Democratic incumbent, Nick Rahal, to say he'd be willing to take a pledge as well. Now, Rahal's capitulation came in the form of an op-ed that said a lot of great things about wanting to keep dark money out of the race, but at the end of the day, the language that he proposed contained a glaring loophole that allowed one of his biggest spenders to continue spending. So in the final 2 weeks of the race, we actually went up with an ad, pretty aggressive ad, calling Rahal out for his hypocrisy on this issue. And when it came to election day, he lost. Now, we don't at all pretend to have been the only force in that race. There really is almost never a singular force in any race. However, polling that we conducted after the election showed that 40% of voters in the district were aware of our campaign, and of that subset, 2/3 voted against Rahal, which is how we were urging them to vote. So we feel pretty confident that our campaign had a significant role in the debate and in the dialogue of that race, which I think shows promise for the future. So really, walking away from 2014, one of our key learnings is that actually this strategic model has potential, and not just the potential to move candidates and change their behavior, but the potential to do so pretty efficiently. So the average campaign cost of our work is less than $150,000 per race, which, in everyday dollars is still a lot of money, but relative to the amount of money that we are keeping out, which is, in the millions, if not tens of millions, is a pretty low price tag. And so we think there's a lot of potential to basically continue with our work. And in 2016, there are going to be at least 10 competitive Senate races, dozens of competitive House races, and we think there's a real opportunity to make reform pledges a significant part of the upcoming election. Now, when I talk about our work, a lot of times people's initial reaction is, this all sounds great, it's really exciting, but I'm curious, why focus on these voluntary race-at-a-time pledges rather than work for legislative reform? And so I just want to underscore what I see as the value of the pledges. First and foremost, when upwards of 90% of Americans are basically thinking that our situation is hopeless, I think the pledges have the potential to be powerful solutions and examples of reform working, to show people that reform is possible, to show the value of it in terms of tangible outcomes that it achieves. And, at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is, this is a really hard movement to be in. As an activist, as a money and politics activist, we've seen a lot of setbacks over the last 10 years. The problem is continuing to grow worse. Even the people who care most about this, I think it's difficult for them to stay engaged, not basically be consumed by the cynicism. And so I think there's potential in these campaigns to generate important wins and be a source of hope. Basically give people a reason to engage and then see results after they do in the near term. Similarly, so much of the focus in the media surrounding this issue is on the problem. It's on the horse race coverage. It's on the millions and millions of dollars that are pouring in. It's basically that's solidifying this sense of public cynicism. The work that we can do is basically shifting the conversation towards solutions. It also is an important, it can be a litmus test for the viability of reform in certain political geographies. So if we get involved in a certain state and see wild traction, in the media and among the electorate, then that could be a great sign that it would be valuable to run a follow-up campaign by way of a ballot measure, such as those that our friends at Every Voice and other organizations are advocating for. And finally, in a post-Citizens United world, when it's literally impossible to legislate our way out of this super PAC problem, this can be a unique tool for stemming the flow of money in elections. While we can't be involved in every race, we can be involved in some key races and really change the dynamic. So I look forward to taking any questions that you have and talking to you all after the panel. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Keep us going, Mr. Ryan.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Seamus Ryan. I am Senior Counsel at the Campaign Legal Center in D.C. I'm not a member of Congress. So I'm going to address one of the questions I was invited to address here today, which is how has the landscape changed for public financing of elections post-Citizens United? Unlimited super PAC and 501c4 and other outside group fundraising and spending, if used for so-called independent spending, has placed a major pressure on the legal line that divides coordinated spending from independent spending. How do we define independent spending effectively? And when it comes to public financing, why should we be spending millions and millions of dollars on a public financing program if the participating candidates can accept potentially corrupting or can go out there, I'm sorry, not accept, but can go out there and solicit for these outside groups and effectively coordinate with these outside groups unlimited funds? So I'm going to both talk a little bit about Connecticut as a case study, a jurisdiction with public financing that has been wrestling with this issue of outside group spending and the line between independent spending and coordinated spending. And I have some friends from the State Elections Enforcement Commission in Connecticut here, Michael Brandy, the executive director, Shannon Keefe, his lawyer. So hopefully they'll be able to flesh out my remarks in the comment period a little bit more. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit about a very important Wisconsin State Supreme Court decision that came down last Thursday in the John Doe proceedings there. So first, Connecticut. In 2014, Connecticut had a gubernatorial election. The two major party candidates were publicly financed. That is Governor Donnell Malloy received $6.5 million in public funds to run his general election campaign, and his opponent, Republican Tom Foley, likewise received $6.5 million in public funds to run his general election campaign. So keep that in mind. That's kind of the backstory of why I care about these other developments there last year. And in June of 2013, Governor Malloy signed into law some reforms to strengthen the coordination rules in the state, referring explicitly in his press around that time to the need to address Citizens United and big outside spending, unlimited outside spending. But Governor Malloy has long been a member of the Democratic Governors Association, and in the years leading up to 2014, he raised lots of money for DGA. DGA is a 527 entity that is not subject to any contribution limits whatsoever, and Governor Malloy was headlining their fundraising events. And in 2014, DGA's lawyers at Perkins Coie sought a declaratory ruling from the Connecticut State Elections Enforcement Commission that Malloy's fundraising for DGA would not be relevant at all to any investigation of whether governor coordinated with DGA in DGA's spending, because DGA made clear publicly that it intended to spend big in the Connecticut gubernatorial race. The state agency refused to give that declaratory ruling, and DGA last summer sued the state, seeking an injunction of the state's enforcement of coordination statutes and regulations. The organization that employs me, the Campaign Legal Center, we represented in that case as Friends of the Court the Connecticut League of Women Voters, Connecticut Common Cause, Connecticut Citizen Action. And fortunately, at the earliest stages of that litigation, the court denied DGA's request for a preliminary injunction, and then DGA withdrew its lawsuit. It saw the writing on the wall, things were not going as it has hoped, and presumably it preferred to not have a final decision on the merits saying the state can look at fundraising as a form of coordination. So again, they withdrew their lawsuit. So $6.5 million in general election public financing to Governor Malloy. Meanwhile, in the 2014 gubernatorial race, there was a record $18 million in independent spending in Connecticut's gubernatorial race. This was a five-fold increase of the independent spending in the preceding 2014 gubernatorial race. $9.3 million was supporting Malloy, $8.9 million supporting Foley, so roughly evenly split in terms of supportive independent expenditures. $4 million of the $9.3 million supporting Governor Malloy came from DGA. They actually contributed to an in-state group called Connecticut Forward, which then actually made the independent expenditure ad buys. So what is the point of Connecticut's $100 contribution limit applicable to publicly financed candidates if these same individuals can go out there and raise unlimited contributions for groups that turn around and spend those dollars directly in support of those participating candidates' campaigns? It's a question we all need to wrestle with as advocates of, those of us who are advocates, as I am, of public financing programs. I'm going to skip now to Wisconsin and the decision last week in the John Doe case, which may or hopefully will not be a bellwether for the direction of regulation of coordination in elections around this country. So at issue in the Wisconsin John Doe case was the legal question of whether or not a state can regulate coordination of ad buys by outside groups that stop short of express candidate advocacy. They don't say vote for or vote against. They instead engage in what is sometimes referred to as issue advocacy, or as I would call sham issue advocacy, hard-hitting attack ads on candidates that just stop short of saying vote for or vote against. At issue in the John Doe investigation were expenditures by Wisconsin Club for Growth that were reportedly coordinated with Scott Walker, Governor Scott Walker, now presidential candidate Scott Walker, in his attempts to defend himself in a recall election. Wisconsin Club for Growth spent big in that election. Again, the Campaign Legal Center represented several amici in that case, filing a brief, including Common Cause of Wisconsin and League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. And Governor Walker reportedly raised millions for Wisconsin Club for Growth. So not only did they reportedly talk about how Wisconsin Club for Growth would spend the money in support of the governor, but the governor actually raised the funds that would be spent on these ads. Now, Wisconsin does not today have a public financing program. Until the 2011 budget, Wisconsin did have a public financing program, ironically enough, for state Supreme Court. as well as some other state offices. In a 4-2 decision by the state Supreme Court last week, and this includes in the majority of 2 state Supreme Court justices who were asked to recuse themselves because they were supported by spending by Wisconsin Club for Growth. They refused to recuse themselves from this case. They held that the state's statutory definitions of expenditure and contribution, which hinge on the phrases "for political purposes" and "for the purpose of influencing an election," that these statutes are limited to express advocacy and its functional equivalent. So they said there were no expenditures under this new definition of what constitutes an expenditure in Wisconsin state law that could have been coordinated. Investigation over. They ordered the investigation to be halted. They ordered evidence to be destroyed. And interestingly, they did not cite any Supreme Court precedent actually addressing coordination. The Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, has never said in a decision that when it comes to coordination, it can only be applied, the analysis can only be applied to express candidate advocacy. That has never been the federal law, and it's never been addressed by the Supreme Court. In fact, in 2003, in the McConnell decision, the Supreme Court explicitly upheld a provision of the McCain-Feingold law that defines the term electioneering communication to mean TV and radio ads that simply mention a candidate within 30 or 60 days of a primary or general election, respectively, upheld the treatment of those types of ads as coordinated expenditures when there's certain conduct between the spenders and the outside group. And in fact, the Federal Election Commission's regulation on coordination definitely regulates any ad that mentions a candidate within 90 days of a House or Senate race or 120 days of a presidential race as a coordinated expenditure if one of the content prongs of the test are met, meaning if there was some interaction between the outside spender and the candidate about that ad. Instead, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court relied on some Supreme Court precedent that had nothing to do with coordination. No facts alleging coordination. I'm referring to the Wisconsin Right to Life decision in which a group in Wisconsin was running ads attacking Senator Russ Feingold. They weren't coordinating with him on their attack ads with him. Citizens United, which was about a documentary, so-called documentary attacking Hillary Clinton. No allegations or facts in that case of coordination. Yet they were the basis for the state Supreme Court's decision. So under the Wisconsin State Supreme Court's decision, you can only regulate as a coordinated expenditure activity that involves express advocacy, saying vote for or vote against a candidate. What about a candidate's rent for their office space? What about a candidate's staff salaries? What about a candidate's catering bills for their fundraising events? None of that entails express advocacy. So is it legal now in Wisconsin for C4s, like Wisconsin Club for Growth, that do not have to disclose their donors, to pay for all of these types of candidate activities? Who knows? It seems under the court's decision that that would be allowable. What does this have to do with public financing? Well, if Wisconsin ever brings back its public financing programs, it'll be directly relevant. But even more importantly, there's a chance that this case will be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The special prosecutor in the case is contemplating filing a cert petition with the U.S. Supreme Court on one or both grounds of the substantive underlying legal issues. Can a state, or can the federal government for that matter, regulate as coordination, non-express advocacy? They're also thinking about appealing on the recusal issue because there's this U.S. Supreme Court decision from a few years ago in a case called Caperton that had similar facts in which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that recusal was required. So this could go to the U.S. Supreme Court. I have grave reservations that I will reserve for our discussion period about filing a cert petition in those cases. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Bring us home, New York City Council Member Lander.
I think I'm supposed to try to bring some small, tiny ray of light after that. It's wonderful to be here with so many friends and so many people who have really been champions on the issue broadly, but especially on building New York City's quite remarkable system. So thanks to the campaign finance system and to Fritz and Art and Amy and to the Brennan Center for doing this. I do think it's worth saying, and I have to, whether this, in addition to digging in on the models, thinking about what's necessary to elevate this issue. You know, sitting here at this moment with the presidential race starting, and with this issue nowhere on the radar screen of the issues that the candidates are talking about, that the media is talking about, that voters are asking about, and especially to be here in New York State, you know, still just months after the Moreland Commission debacle. And yes, there was some good, you know, some folks in the room and the Attorney General and some folks, but, you know, the level of attention we have, we at least count on major corruption crises to be something of a push toward reform. And that's not happening at the moment. Meanwhile, you know, we are facing existential crises like climate change and income inequality. Our ability to act on those matters severely inhibited as a result of the role of money in politics, and we aren't making those connections anywhere near enough. We're not doing it in New York City, we're not doing it in New York State, we're not doing it in the country. So I do think what the politics are going to be of, and it's hard when there's no sense of possibility given those set of rulings, but I think we've got to keep thinking about it. I love the game theory models. What I'm going to pitch is continuing to build on the strength of systems like New York City. If you look at what's happening in fast food work and the fight for 15 and raising the minimum wage or paid sick days, cities around the country are doing the right thing even when their states or the federal government won't. I love the advocacy at state levels. Obviously, a statewide system's better than a local system where we can win it. But there are an awful lot of progressive reform cities across the country that do not have anything like the system that Representative Sarbanes talked about or that we have here. So we've got a network of progressive local elected officials around the country called Local Progress. If there are people interested in working together on thinking about just one element, I mean, we've got to eventually get the federal stuff revisited and redecided, but let's keep doing a lot of things, and one of them should be spreading systems like New York City's through cities across the country. Obviously, implicit in that is I'm not just an enormous supporter of New York City's system. I feel just lucky to be a participant, and to the people that did the work that Fritz talked about earlier to make it possible. It is challenging to comply with. I would be lying if I didn't say it was. I've had my own tussles with the CFB staff that are here on both of my audits. It is a pain in the ass, and it is absolutely essential. Those are two facts, and we have to own that. We got to be willing to talk to elected officials, because what happened when they were looking at these issues in Albany was that many state legislators called their city colleagues and said, "How big a pain is it?" And it's a big pain, but there's no way around it. You can't imagine a system that has the regulatory strength. It is essential to do the matching, so that I agree with the Congressman. It's not all rules-based. It has to be matching and empowerment-based. But obviously that can only work if you're confident that there's attention to how that money's spent and that people follow the rules they're supposed to in exchange for the money. I've had the honor of doing two things to try to help support and strengthen those rules. The smaller of them was just an amicus brief in the lawsuit Ogneveni v. Schwartz, I guess originally, and Ogneveni v. Parks eventually, that saw it after Arizona and Citizens United to challenge elements of our system. And one critical element that I don't think we talk about enough, so I just want to underline it, are the doing business rules in New York City's system. The spending limits and the contribution limits are important. The matching funds are essential. I'll talk about independent expenditure in a minute. But the doing business rules, does everyone not know New York City's doing business rules? All right, so contributors to a New York City, I'll use the city council limits, they're higher for citywide candidates. The max contribution I can take is $2,750 from any one contributor, and there's spending limits. With matching funds, you could get about 90 grand, you could spend about 200 grand, so good limits there. The matching funds for eligible contributors up to 175, matchable 6-to-1, as the congressional proposal would be. But a very key element is that anyone that does business with the city, that has discretionary business, gets contracts, is bringing land use deals, can only give $250, and none of it is matchable. And the evidence that this has had dramatic impact in New York City is overwhelming. You can see the numbers in the report that's out on the book, but it was over $250 prior to this rule came from people doing business with the city, and in city council races, closer to a third, mostly real estate contributors. So nothing could be more clearly pay to play than the outsized role of people with direct business in government being the largest contributors to people's elections. It went from 25% to 2% as a result of New York City's doing business rules, and mercifully they survived legal challenge. And I think they are an essential element of similar city and state systems around the country. And then the other thing that we worked together on last year with the Brennan Center and the CFB itself and folks in the room was to pass Local Law 41 of 2014, which is our requirements for on-communications disclosure of independent expenditures. Now, look, the right answer is much more, until we can find some way, whether it's through game theory or whether it's through a different Supreme Court or a different Congress or a constitutional amendment, not being able to limit those dollars at all. I just want to say, I don't want to ever make it sound like I think the disclosure rules that we have, which are the strongest in the country, are sufficient. They are the strongest in the country. They're the best we can do. They're nowhere near sufficient. So I just want to say that as a caveat at the outside, but it's important to get them right. The Campaign Finance Board, without legislation, issued a really good set of rules, really seeing that there was going to be a big flood of IEs as a result of Citizens United, and even in advance of the 2013 election cycle, defined what an IE would be and required disclosure of essentially every contribution and every expenditure. So we don't, in New York City elections, have a dark money problem. You could go on the CFB website and look at essentially all the contributions and all the expenditures. But there's a couple of big problems there, obviously. First of all, not too many people go on the website who get the mail or see the ads or hear the radio ads. And second, the way the rules initially got set up, it was easy to shield donor identity behind LLCs and corporate contributors. And so, we did indeed see in 2013 a flood of independent expenditures, again, very well reported in the CFB's. If you haven't read it, it's like my Bible, the CFB's 2013 report on the cycle. So in 17 of 41 city council races, IEs spent more than the candidates, and in 10 or a dozen, they spent more than double what the candidates spent. That makes it hard to figure out how to make the CounterPAC pledge work. Candidates are not going to be able to pledge, I won't spend anything at all on my campaign. So how we could do some kind of pledge model, I'd love to see it in New York City. It's conceptually hard to figure out what to do given our already good rules that you buy into and sort of how little IE money it is. The ads were very negative. Most voters didn't see the reporting. The biggest case in point in 2013 was this super PAC called Jobs for New York, lovely title, created by the Real Estate Board for New York, raised largely in $50,000 and $100,000 contributions. Remember, we're limited to $27.50, $250 if you're doing business. $50,000 and $100,000 contributions from real estate LLCs, some of them from the same individual with a few LLCs, many of them, of course, with projects in front of the city, severe violation of those doing business rules. They raised and spent, 90% of the $7 million they raised came from 120 LLCs and partnerships associated with specific development projects, and you couldn't see who those individuals were. And they sent out 541 communications, as I said, in some cases spending more than their candidates spent, and a lot of it really negative. So we adopted Local Law 41 in 2014. It does three things. First, it requires disclosure on every ad or communication, sized differently for television, for radio, for pencils, for mailings, making clear it's funded by an outside group, it is an independent expenditure, it's not authorized by the candidate. Not only do you have to list, as you did before, the name, but you have to list the three top donors and either the owner, the chief executive, or the chief executive officer, so you can really see who it is that's communicating with you. And you have to include a URL, the nyc.gov/follow the money, where the CFB maintains its great website where you can really drill down into all the information that you need, and hopefully that will drive more traffic to a real understanding of who's spending to communicate with you. So Connecticut and California and Rhode Island all have related laws. I think we're all trying to figure out, especially in that piercing the veil and getting back to the individuals, what will work best. So we haven't had a cycle with this new law yet, but we will soon. And I think one thing we've got to do across cities and states is just see which one of those work and then spread those out across the country as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask a few questions of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So, and Congressman Sarbanes, can you still hear me?
I can.
Okay. So you are from a political family. Could you contrast the campaign finance environment that your father had to navigate as a senator compared with the one that you have to navigate today? For example, what is the impact of super PACs?
Well, for starters, I think that the presence of money, the influence of money in our political affairs is sort of metastasized just in the last 10 years, really, and that's the time period since my father left political office. The amounts you needed to raise directly to run campaigns have skyrocketed. That in turn has led to dependence, increasing dependence on these sources of campaign funding that then turn around and wield special interest in Washington. So there's no question that it has gotten worse. Obviously, the super PACs hadn't entered the scene yet. I think the effect of the super PACs is just to contribute and crystallize the cynicism that was already creeping in on the part of the public when they look at Washington and they look at government and politics and Congress. They now have something they can point to, a sort of bogeyman in the system to put a punctuation mark on why they feel the way they do. But even before the super PACs arrived, even before the Citizens United case, I think there was already a feeling creeping into the body politic, into the electorate, that they weren't in charge anymore here in Washington, and that special interests had sort of occupied a place of really calling the shots on policy. And so it's all a matter of degree. And I like to judge where things stand by looking through the lens of the constituents I meet every day. Oftentimes, even on this topic, we can get inside our own heads in Washington. We can divide the problem based on our particular perspective as members of Congress, as experts, as advocates. But the best measure of where we arrive in terms of the state of our democracy is the way, 50 people sitting in a room at a town hall, randomly selected, express their sense of anger and frustration. And so the solutions, I say this because the solutions we design and we put in front of that cynical electorate have to be ones that respond directly to that feeling of being left out. And that's why I'm so focused on the kind of empowerment frame as I described earlier, because I think that's the way back to restoring some trust on the part of the American people in their government.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Costa, do you have plans to scale up the dark money pledges?
So in 2016, we're hoping to be active in at least 3 competitive federal races. We'll likely be focusing on dark money again, but probably also expanding to include a pledge more similar to the one that Warren and Brown enacted that would keep all super PAC money out. It's going to be, exactly what we ask for is going to be dependent on the particular races that we get into. But what is perhaps most exciting to me about this sort of pledge-based model that we're pursuing is the flexibility it affords to ask for really any kind of reform goal. So, the pledges, in my mind, are just a tool to make reform happen in the near term, it's a tool to model reform and action. And so theoretically, we could be going after anything. We could be going after, for example, a higher proportion of small dollar donations. Get candidates to promise that they'll take at least, 50% of their money in denominations of $250 or less, or something along those lines. So that's kind of the future that I see for our work. But in the coming cycle, it will likely be focused on dark money and no super PAC money.
Okay. Mr. Ryan, there was recently a big win in the DC Circuit in the Wagner case, which upheld the 75-year-old Hatch Act, which bans federal contractors from giving to federal candidates. Is there language in that case that we can build on as reformers?
Short answer, yes, I suppose. There's a pretty, just to keep it completely real, there's a pretty big hole in that federal law that was just upheld, which is that these government contractors can set up PACs and give to their PACs and contribute using their corporate PACs. But anytime we have a win, it's very helpful to our cause. The wins I really like to point to are the wins we are getting in the disclosure realm, where we're pretty much winning across the board. Most recently, an important circuit court decision out of a case out of Delaware, where the Campaign Legal Center, we are co-counsel representing the state in that case. Big win in that case, so disclosure, lots of good news there if you're looking for encouragement. Wagner decision, much happier winning it than losing it. And yeah, let's mine it for whatever nuggets are in there that might be useful.
Okay. And Council Member Lander, in your estimation, does having the New York City pay-to-play restrictions and the public financing system enable the City Council to be more effective? And if so, is there a concrete example?
Yes, I guess I think there is. First, we've seen a lot more turnover in the council. There's in both the 2009 and the 2013 cycles, there were incumbents who lost, challengers who won. It's hard to point to feeling the difference between serving with a set of people, many of whom had most of their money come from people that are doing business with us, to not serving with that. But I think that's a big deal. And, you can even see it, the hottest topic of the day where these things are coming together at the city levels around the for-hire vehicle and Uber debate. And look, there's no doubt that that there's money in politics. They're on all sides. The medallioners have given a lot of money. Uber would like to give a lot of money. They have more restrictions from doing so. But you can see council members debating it. I mean, you see in the media these days people taking a bunch of different points of view. It is much less an issue that's sort of moving with a big consensus. And I think that's definitely in part because, the role of money is just much less significant than it was before, for sure.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Are there questions from the audience? And do we have microphones? Okay, we have a microphone. Yes, ma'am. Wait until the microphone gets to you. Right here. Yes.
Well, let me thank you all for letting us be here and for airing all these arguments in front of us. And I've been putting you guys on Twitter and Periscope. So this is augmenting the live feed that you already have. I'm concerned about the 2016 election. This has become an election of super PACs. It's become an election of secondary PACs and LLCs that are funding the ground organizations of the campaigns. And it seems to me that unless Citizens United is overturned and overturned quickly, there is no way that the public will feel that they have a voice in the elections. And that's what I hear more than anything is, what happened to one man, one vote? And I went through Sarbanes' 6-to-1 ratio. It means they still can't compete because the parties are locked up. What do we do?
Congressman Sarbanes, could you hear that question?
Yeah, I think I did hear it. So I have a couple of thoughts. First off, there's no question this campaign cycle we're going to break another set of records, both with respect to the amount of money that's directly raised into these presidential campaigns, as well as the super PAC presence, which will, I think, blow through all past cycles in terms of the amounts that get contributed. That is dispiriting. Obviously, I recognize that. On the other, again, trying to look at this through the lens of the average person out there, what I'm saying to folks is, okay, we can wring our hands about a system where you have these billion-dollar campaigns and you have the super PACs out there. The question for everyday citizens is, do you see yourself in this at all? And the answer is no. It's almost like it's happening on another planet. And so I think coming to people who feel that way with an empowerment message that sort of says, okay, while that universe continues to pursue its own goals, we're going to go build another universe. And we're going to start small, but we can point to successes around the country. We can point to systems where citizens have taken back over their government through small donor financing models. And we can try to put that proposal in terms of the way Congress operates and other elected officials operate around the country. And the extreme contrast of that kind of a proposal to the way the system is now, I think actually can be a motivator for people. It's sort of saying to them, how many more stories do you want to read about the Koch brothers? Okay, they're two billionaires who are trying to take over the American government. I mean, it's the oldest story in the book, and it's kind of boring after a while. I'd much rather go hear the story of some citizen organizer in a community who knows how to assemble 50 or 100 or 200 small donors who can earn matching funds and turn that group into a source of power in their own democracy. Let's start telling those stories. Let's start writing about those people. Let us create a stark contrast between where things are headed in this one system and where they could go if we build a different system. And I just, to send it back, I just wanted to comment on this issue of, the super PACs playing in these campaigns where you might have public financing. And does that kind of neutralize our ambition as to what a small donor public financing system can achieve? I don't think it has to demoralize us. So let's take the relationship of a publicly financed candidate to outside group or outside money that is supporting that candidate. I know that Paul Ryan described that situation in Connecticut. I think what will happen is as a culture of public financing takes hold, it will generate an accountability where candidates who want to turn to small donors and everyday citizens and earn public taxpayer funds in support of that on a matching basis, they're going to become more accountable for other conduct and the extent to which they're fraternizing with kind of the super PAC and the outside group world. And that accountability will fall back on them in terms of their political competitiveness, and it ought to. So I think that's how that dynamic will mature over time if we have real investment in public financing. And now let's take the situation of a publicly financed candidate in relationship to an outside group or super PAC that is attacking that candidate. Because the concern there is, well, you raise money for your campaign, but if a super PAC comes in and targets you, it's not going to make a difference. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that there are saturation points when it comes to outside spending. You get to a point where the extra $1 million that's getting put into the campaign may move the needle by a point or 2 points, but it's not adding a whole lot to the dynamic of the race. What that means is the candidates don't have to have as much money as the outside groups. They just need to have enough money to keep their voice on the playing field up through election day. And that, in combination with building a network of citizens who are ready to step up with $25 and $50 and $100 donations, particularly if that candidate says, I need your help now, I'm under attack. That enough money to make the voice of the candidate and the voice of their supporters heard through Election Day, and they can be successful. And we have plenty of examples of that when you look over the last 2 or 3 election cycles. So I'm not dispirited. I'm not concerned that the super PAC phenomenon will necessarily eviscerate the power of a small donor, publicly financed matching system, as long as robust enough to give candidates enough dollars to keep their voice out there through Election Day and be competitive. And by the way, you build a small donor network of citizens that are activated for you, that can be 2 or 3 points on the ground in the final days of an election, and that can match the point or two that super PAC is earning with another $1 million of television spending.
And can I just say, I do think the New York City case bears out what the Congressman said. We had a lot of outside money in the 2013 cycle, many of it for or against candidates backed by small donors through the campaign finance system. And the results were across the board. Quite a few of the candidates that Jobs for New York spent the most money on did not win. In the most significant case, a challenger beat an incumbent backed by one of the largest amounts, maybe the largest amount of outside spending. I think largely on the genuine grassroots energy of contributions and donations. It did have some other negative effects. Those candidates, of course, then recruited their own outside spenders, and but I agree that there is hope in. We should not feel less hopeful about building out matching systems built around small donors with the mantra that the super PACs are going to overwhelm everything, so it's hopeless. I think the evidence bears out what the Congressman says.
Can I comment very briefly on the issue of super PACs in the 2016 presidential race? There is a provision of the McCain-Feingold law upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court that prohibits any entity directly or indirectly established, financed, maintained, or controlled by a federal candidate from spending any money in connection with an election unless it's raised under the federal limits. Much of the super PAC activity that you're now seeing in the presidential race, in my view and the view of the Campaign Legal Center, is illegal. We have filed complaints with the FEC and with the Department of Justice, so don't accept it as permissible under Citizens United. Citizens United, the case had nothing to do with outside groups who were, or which were established by candidates. And what we're seeing in 2016 race is a bunch of outside groups set up by candidates. It's illegal under the current law.
Okay, there's a question from this gentleman right here.
With the proliferation of public financing of campaigns on a municipal, state, and now federal level, thanks to Congressman Sarbanes' proposed small donor tax credit, how do we counteract the fiscal conservatives who feel that our public resources could be used for more pressing issues such as entitlements, expanding entitlements, and upholding the social contract? How do we counteract their argument?
Would anyone like to volunteer for that one? Go.
I'm happy. So when I got into this business in the late 90s, one of the first jurisdictions I studied, I was working at the Center for Governmental Studies, no longer in existence, but was in LA, was New York City. And I think the New York City Campaign Finance Board put out a report 15, 16 years ago, and I believe it quoted Mayor Giuliani. Is that, anyone remember this, where he referred to the cost of the city's public financing program as a rounding error on the city's budget? Who was it? Less than a rounding error. And when you look at the math, this proves to be the case. I also studied the city of Los Angeles' very highly regarded public financing program. The city of LA, at the time I studied it, now almost about a dozen years ago, was spending more to maintain the city zoo than to maintain one of the best public financing programs in the country. So when you look at just look at the dollar amount these programs cost, they may induce some sticker shock. But when you put them in the context of other line items in a municipal budget, a state budget, federal budget, they are well worth what is a relatively minor, comparatively speaking, expense.
I would just add, candidates bought and sold by special interests are far worse for the public fisc than the cost of campaign finance. So, a conversation with a genuine fiscal conservative, I think you could have on those grounds. Let's look at the impact of what's happening with the budget And look, that's not just corporations looking for loopholes in regulatory framework. It is public sector unions as well. The point here is to limit the control of people with a direct interest in what's going to happen to the public fisc. So, where that's a smokescreen argument for somebody looking to protect the interests of special interests and corporate donors, let's call it what it is, where someone genuinely has an interest in the public fisc, I think the argument is straightforward that the tiny amounts of money we're spending actually result in enormous savings over time.
Congressman, did you want to respond to that?
Well, first of all, I think it's a great question, and you're right that this is one of the objections or questions that we get asked when we go to some of our conservative colleagues. They just want you to know, my bill has over 150 co-sponsors. 149 of them are Democrats, and one is a Republican. But what we're finding is that their appetite on the conservative end of the political spectrum for this kind of empowerment reform. And if you think about it, the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movement in their purest form came from the same place, which is a strong sentiment on the part of everyday folks out there that there's some powerful lead of groups in Washington and New York that are running the country and everybody else is being left out. So the response I give is a couple things. First of all, if you talk about the return on investment in terms of good public policy that can result if we free or liberate the current public policy machinery from the influence of big money, the return on investment is huge. So it's a modest amount that you would have to spend on standing up a public financing system, even at the federal level, when you compare it to the return you get with good public policy, and frankly, solving gridlock. In 1982, Bob Dole, who was just about to become the Republican Senate Minority Leader at that time, said, essentially, if we ever get to where everyone has a PAC up here on Capitol Hill, we'll never get anything done. Well, 3 decades later, game over. Everyone has a PAC, and we're not getting anything done. When you lift up the hood on American democracy and you look under it, you see that the machinery is completely gummed up by money. So that kind of reform message, making government more efficient, making it more responsive to the concerns of the public, and being able to do that for fairly modest investment, I think can have traction with more conservative parts of the political spectrum. The other thing I say to people is, somebody's going to own the government. It's not just going to sit there unattended. It's either going to be big money and special interest, in which case when it comes time to make policy, the institutions of government will lean in the direction of that big money and that special interest, or it's going to be the people. And the public has to decide if they want to own their own government. And in America, if you want to own something, you got to pay for it. But the good news is, it's a pretty modest investment, as I said, to get to a system that really reflects the input and the perspective and the priorities of the American people. And so I think there are compelling responses that we can design to that objection, and we're certainly out as we move around and talk to some of our more conservative colleagues here.
Yes, ma'am.
I would like to pick up on a point that Fritz Schwartz made about the states, and I'd like to address this to Brad Lander and to Jay Costa. To Brad, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about why, well, I know why, but would you expand on why we can't get anything done in New York State? And Jay, I would like you to tell us about other states that might be dealing with this issue. I always think about Oregon. Is Oregon doing anything? There are places in the country that know and agree with the general direction of this morning, and particularly the things that Fritz laid out.
It's a great question, and I think a lot of people in the room are familiar with the New York case, the New York State case, and it's endlessly frustrating. I guess I would say this: it is it's entrenched, it's bipartisan, entrenched special interest corruption that has kept Albany the way it is for a long time. That said, for now, I think our nearest term hope, and I'm going to be a partisan now in a nonpartisan space, I think we need a Democratic state Senate, but we need to demand that as we give money to Democratic state Senate candidates, they commit to make campaign finance reform a top priority, in addition to sort of the, what are the other issues there. And I think that could be a game changer. The Assembly does keep passing a good campaign finance reform, and that's notwithstanding what happened with its prior leader, right? Though there was a corruption problem there, but it didn't prevent the Assembly from continuing to pass the right campaign finance reform. Let's get a Senate that will as well, and make it impossible for the governor not to sign it. So that's what we've got to do. It is achievable, whether we get it in 2016 or whether we get it in 2018. We can bring that change to New York State. And I do think you see things change quickly. I guess I have to say, on the one hand, it is true that there is entrenched corruption that makes it difficult to make change. And on the other hand, we know what the laws are that we need. It is entirely possible to see them passing both the Assembly and the Senate and the governor signing it, not this term, but soon. But not, and I don't mean in our lifetimes. I mean next term or the term after that. And we should not let that slip as a goal. And it's just easy to. This is a hard thing about campaign finance. Somehow the issues that I equally feel about, low-wage work and climate change and, public transportation, they stay up in the public eye. These are harder. We must make the 2016, and hopefully we'll get it done, and after the 2016 election, we won't have to focus on it in 2018. It has to be a top priority for New York State elections to bring, a matching funds, clean elections, public financing system like the one, they're working on in Congress and like the one we have in New York City to New York State.
And I would submit that where we see things fail at the state level or any level for that matter, it is a result of the public will, the public belief in the possibility of reform not being there. We really need this to be a voting issue. There are other states that have gotten it done. Arizona, Maine, Connecticut are all great examples of states that have effective and good, public financing systems that they've put into place. I think it's really likely that we'll see a vote in Washington State in this cycle on whether or not to put something into place. And there is a growing public will in other states for reform. New Hampshire is a great example where there is a movement basically to address this issue of money in politics. And so I think there is great potential in certain states. The ballot measure is a particularly interesting strategy for putting public financing systems into place because it requires voters, right? It doesn't require state legislatures who themselves are often under the influence of money. So I think that that is a strategy that I'm personally excited about, and I know there is a lot of great work being done on, and so I think that we should keep an eye out for that. Just to add one quick note to the previous question on how to address the fiscal conservative argument, there's actually a great study done by the Cato Institute, which is a conservative think tank that actually estimates the amount of money that is lost every year to corporate welfare is upwards of $65 billion. So even if we, and this is coming from a conservative group, and so even if we recover just a fraction of that amount of money on an annual basis, the return, it pays for, the system would pay for itself. And so I think that is the kind of argument that we can use to address the concerns raised by the gentleman.
Okay. Being mindful of the hour, please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.